Good evening, and welcome to the Quiet Pantheon. I'm glad you're here. Before we begin, take a moment just for yourself. Let yourself settle into wherever you're resting. Feel the weight of your body sinking down, growing heavier and softer. There is nothing you need to do now. Nowhere you need to be. Nothing left to solve or finish or carry. Let your shoulders drop just a little. Let your jaw soften. And let your breathing slow all on its own. In. And gently out. In. And slowly out. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story. A true story from a very long time ago. The quiet life of a man named Thomas Aquinas. We will move through it slowly, very slowly. You do not need to follow every word. You do not need to remember any of it. My voice is simply here to walk beside you softly as you drift down toward sleep. If your thoughts wander, that is good. If your eyes have already closed, that is good too. So, let us begin. Gently. Our story begins almost 800 years ago. In a warmer, slower world. A world lit only by sun and moon and the small flames of candles and hearth fires. A world where the night was truly dark and truly quiet. Picture the south of Italy. Soft green hills folding into one another. Olive trees, silver and grey, their leaves turning gently in the breeze. Valleys full of warm light in the morning, and long blue shadows in the evening. And here and there upon the higher hills, the shapes of old stone castles, watching quietly over the land. In this country, in a region near the town of Aquino, between the great city of Rome and the seaport of Naples, there stood one such castle. It was called Roccaseca, a fortress of pale stone, built high on a rocky hill. Its walls were thick and warm-coloured, the shade of old bread or honey in shadow. Its windows were narrow. From its heights you could look out across the olive groves and the quiet valleys and watch the slow weather move across the hills. In the evenings the wind would move softly through those valleys. The light would turn golden, then rose, then grey. Bells might sound far off from some small church or monastery. And then the dark would come, and the stars, more stars than we ever see now, scattered thick across the black sky. And it was here, in this castle on its hill, around the year 1225, that a child was born. The child whose story we will follow tonight. He was born into a noble family. A powerful family, old and proud. His father was a man named Landulf, the Count of Aquino. A lord of land and soldiers, a man of ambition who measured his life in holdings and alliances and the rising fortunes of his house. His mother was named Theodora, a woman of strong will and noble blood and a quiet iron of her own. It was a large family. There were many children, many sons and daughters. And in those days, in a family such as this, each child was a kind of investment, a piece in a larger game. The sons especially. Each son was expected to carry the family's name higher into the world. One might become a soldier and win glory and land in war. Another might marry well and bind the family to other powerful houses. And another might enter the church, which, in that age, was not only a holy calling, but also a path to enormous power and wealth and influence. Thomas was the youngest of the sons, the last. And so, almost from the moment he was born, it was decided what his life would be. He himself would have no say in it. Not for many years. The plan was already made. Not far from the castle of Roccasecca, upon another, higher mountain, there stood one of the most famous places in all of Europe. A great monastery, an abbey called Monte Cassino. It had stood for many centuries already. It was ancient even then. A vast complex of stone, crowning the very top of the mountain, with long halls and quiet cloisters, and a great church, and gardens and libraries full of old and precious books. And the family had a plan for young Thomas, and that plan was Monte Cassino. They would give him to the abbey as a small child. He would be raised within its walls, educated by its monks. And one day, this was their hope, their ambition, he would rise to become its abbot, the lord of that great and wealthy monastery. A position of deep influence and high honor, a bright jewel set in the family's crown. And so, when Thomas was only about 5 years old, still a very small boy, he was taken from his home and brought up the long mountain road to Monte Cassino. Imagine that small child walking up that winding path. The great walls rising before him, the huge wooden doors. The cool, dim air inside, after the bright warmth of the day. Rise to feel the quiet of that place. The long stone corridors, where every footstep echoed softly. The slow ringing of bells, marking out the hours of the day, again and again, from before dawn until after dark. The low sound of the monks singing together in the dim light, a deep, calm, rising and falling sound, older than anyone could remember. The smell of candle wax and cold stone, and incense, and old wood, and bread baking somewhere far off. This was the world in which Thomas would grow up. A world of order and silence and slow, repeating rhythm. The same bells, the same prayers, the same hours, day after day after day, like the turning of a great and gentle wheel. For a certain kind of soul, it might have been unbearable. But for Thomas, it seems, it was something like home. For he was, by every account, a quiet child. Watchful, thoughtful, slow to speak, slow to anger. Where other children might run and shout and quarrel, Thomas would sit and listen and wonder. He seemed always to be turning something over, somewhere deep inside himself. And there is a small story told of him from these earliest years. A simple story, but one that those who knew him never forgot. It is said that even as a young boy, there in the abbey, Thomas would go to the monks who taught him and ask them a single question. Again and again and again. Not a child's usual question. Not where or when or why he could not have something. He would look up at them, this small, serious boy, and he would ask them quietly, "What is God? What is God?" 3 small words, and yet perhaps the largest question that can ever be asked. The question that lies underneath all other questions. And here was a child, asking it plainly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to want to know. The monks, of course, could not fully answer him. No one can fully answer it. But the question had taken root in him. It had found a home deep in that quiet, watchful soul. And it would stay there, growing slowly for the rest of his life. In a way, everything that followed, all his long years of study, all the great works he would one day write, all of it was simply this same small boy, still asking the same gentle question. What is God? The years passed softly at Monte Cassino. Thomas learned to read and to write. He learned Latin, the language of the Church, and of learning, and of nearly every book worth reading in that age. He studied the Scriptures, he studied music, and the careful grammar of clear thought. And he grew. He grew tall, and he grew large. For Thomas would become a big man, broad and heavy, and strong of frame. But there was nothing loud about his size. He carried it gently, quietly, the way a great tree carries its height without effort and without display. And all the while, though he was still only a boy, the great plan of his family rested upon him. Abbot of Monte Cassino, Lord of the Mountain. A future already written, waiting for him to grow into it. But the world outside the abbey walls was not as calm as the world within. In those years, there was conflict among the great powers of the age. Quarrels between the emperor and the pope, armies on the move, old alliances breaking and new ones forming. And Monte Cassino, sitting high and proud and wealthy upon its mountain, was caught right in the middle of it. Old years came to the mountain. The abbey was no longer the safe, still, settled place it had been for so long. And so, when Thomas was around 14 years old, a new decision was made about his life. He could not remain at Monte Cassino. He would be sent instead to continue his studies somewhere else. Somewhere far larger and louder and more alive. He would be sent to the city of Naples. Naples. A great city by the sea. After the silence of the mountain, imagine the change for young Thomas. The harbour, crowded with ships, their sails and masts swaying. The markets, full of voices and colour and the smells of fish and spice and smoke. The crowds in the narrow streets, the bright, restless water of the bay, the salt smell of the Mediterranean carried on the wind. And in the middle of all this life and motion stood something new in the world. Something that had hardly existed before that century. A university. A place where young men gathered from many different lands to study and to question and to argue and to learn. It was one of the very first universities in all of Europe. And it was unlike anything Thomas had ever known. And it was here in Naples that the quiet young man met the two great forces that would shape the whole of the rest of his life. The first was a new way of thinking. The second was a new way of living. Let us speak first, gently, of the way of thinking. At the university, Thomas came upon the writings of an ancient philosopher, a man who had lived more than 1,500 years before him, far away in ancient Greece. His name was Aristotle. For long ages, much of Aristotle's work had been lost to the Western world. His books had been kept and studied and carefully preserved instead by scholars in distant lands across the sea. And only slowly, in Thomas's century, were they returning, translated, copied, and carried at last back into the universities of Europe. Like a tide, long gone out, finally flowing back in. And these ideas were thrilling. To some, they were even dangerous. For Aristotle had tried to understand everything. The movement of the stars across the sky, the nature of living things, the plants, the animals, the body. The way the human mind reasons step by careful step. The foundations of right and wrong. He believed that the world could be understood, that it had an order, and that patient, careful, honest thought could uncover that order piece by piece. For a mind like Thomas's, a mind that had been quietly asking what is God since it was 5 years old, these ideas were like cool water to someone who had been a long time thirsty. Here was a whole way of thinking that was vast and deep and rigorous and ordered. And Thomas drank it in. But it raised a great question. A difficult question. The question, in fact, that would become the work of his entire life. If the world could be understood through reason, through human thought alone, then what of faith? What of God and the Scriptures and all the things that are believed but not seen and not proven? Were reason and faith enemies? Did a person have to choose, the mind or the soul? Or could they somehow be brought together, woven patiently into a single peaceful whole? Most people of his time would not even dare to try. Thomas would spend his life trying. And now, the second great force. The new way of living. In the streets of Naples, Thomas came to know a group of men who were, in that age, still new and unusual, and to many people, troubling. They were called the Dominicans. An order of friars, founded only a short time before Thomas was born. But they were not like the monks of Monte Cassino. They did not live behind high walls with vast lands and wealth and quiet security. No. The Dominicans owned almost nothing at all. They had taken vows of poverty, real poverty. They walked from town to town, often barefoot, begging for their daily bread. They had empty hands and empty pockets by choice. And they gave themselves completely to two things. To preaching, carrying the truth out into the world, to ordinary people in the streets and the squares and the markets. And to study, seeking to understand that truth as deeply and as honestly as a human mind possibly could. There was something pure in it, something stripped all the way down to the bone. No comfort, no riches, no safety. Only the search for truth and the sharing of it with nothing held back. And this spoke to something very deep in Thomas. For here was a young man born into wealth and rank and power. A young man whose family had mapped out for him a glittering future, abbot of a rich abbey, a prince of the church, a lord among lords. And what he saw in these poor, barefoot begging friars was something his family had never thought to offer him. A life given over entirely to the one question he had carried since he was a small boy. What is God? Not power, not wealth, not the family name carried ever higher. Just the truth, sought and served with open and empty hands. And so Thomas made a decision. Quietly, in his own slow, certain, unhurried way, he decided to join them, to become a Dominican. To give away the entire future his family had built for him. To set aside the rank and the riches and the high office that had been waiting for him since birth. To take the vow of poverty. To wear the simple, rough habit. To become one of those barefoot men who begged for their bread and owned nothing and lived only for the truth. He was perhaps 19 years old. It is hard now to feel how shocking this was. To us, across so many centuries, it may sound noble and simple and good. But to his family, it was none of those things. To them, it was a disaster, a catastrophe. They had given their youngest son to the church. Yes, good evening. And welcome back to the quiet pantheon. I'm glad you're here again. Before we begin, settle in. Let yourself grow comfortable and still. Feel the weight of your body sinking down, growing heavier and warmer. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. And let your breathing slow, all on its own. In. And gently out. In. And slowly out. There is nothing you need to do now. Nowhere you need to be. Nothing left to carry, or solve, or finish. Tonight, we simply continue our quiet story. You do not need to remember what came before. You do not need to follow every word. My voice is only here to walk beside you softly as you drift down toward sleep. Tonight, we return to the story of Thomas Aquinas, the quiet young man who gave away a life of wealth and rank and power to walk instead the road of empty hands. You may remember the shape of it. He was born into a noble family in a stone castle in the warm hills of southern Italy. He was raised in an ancient mountain monastery and meant one day to become its abbot, a great and wealthy lord of the church. But in the busy seaport of Naples as a young man, he found two things that changed everything. The deep ideas of the philosopher Aristotle, and the simple, poor, searching life of the wandering friars called the Dominicans. And so he had made his choice. He had given away the bright future his family had built for him. He had chosen poverty and empty hands and the single endless question he had carried since he was a small boy. What is God? His family was horrified. And they had decided to act. That is where we left him. And that is where tonight we begin again. The friars knew that the family was angry. They knew that a powerful house, wounded in its pride, might do something rash. and so they thought it wise to send Thomas away. Far away to the north, across the mountains, to the great city of Paris, the very heart of learning in all of Europe. There they hoped he could study in peace, safely beyond the reach of his family. And so a small group of friars set out. On foot, along the old roads, with young Thomas walking among them. Imagine that journey. The dusty roads winding through the hills, the long days of walking, the simple meals, and the nights spent resting wherever they could. Moving slowly north, away from the family lands, toward a new and quiet life. But the family had learned of the plan. His mother, Theodora, was a woman of strong will, and she did not intend to let her youngest son simply vanish into the north, into poverty, into a life she saw as a disgrace. She sent word ahead. Word to her older sons, Thomas's brothers. Hard men, soldiers, men of action and of horses and of swords. And they rode out to find him. Somewhere on the open road, in the quiet country, they came upon the little band of friars walking. Picture it. The sudden sound of hooves growing louder. The riders appearing, the dust. His own brothers armed, surrounding the small group of poor and unarmed friars. There was nothing the friars could do. And so the brothers took Thomas by force. They pulled him away from his companions. And they carried him back. Back south, back toward the family lands, back toward the very castle where he had been born. The journey north, toward freedom and study, was over before it had truly begun. And there, in the family's strongholds, they kept him. A prisoner. In his own family's home. Now, it was not a dungeon. He was a son of the house, not a common captive. He was not chained or starved or thrown into some dark cell. But he was watched, confined, kept within the walls and not permitted to leave. His family hoped that given enough time, his strange new resolve would soften. That he would grow tired or lonely or discouraged. That he would, at last, come to his senses and give up this mad idea and return to the future they had chosen for him. And this captivity lasted a long while. By most accounts, about a year. A whole year. Held within those familiar stone walls, the very rooms, perhaps, where he had played as a small child. A year of his family's pleading and arguing and pressure. His mother came to speak with him. His brothers came to speak with him. They tried persuasion, they tried reason, they tried anger. They reminded him of his duty, of the family's name, of all that he was throwing away. They tried, it seems, almost everything they could think of. And through it all, Thomas remained quiet and calm and utterly, gently immovable. There is a famous story told of this year. It is one of the best-known tales of his whole life. And whether every detail is exactly true, it tells us something real about the kind of man he was. His brothers, it is said, grew desperate. Their words had not moved him. Their anger had not moved him. And so they decided to try something darker. They wished to break his vow, to shatter his commitment to a life of purity and study and prayer. And so, the story goes, they sent into his room a young woman, beautiful, and meant to tempt him away from the path he had chosen. And what did Thomas do? He rose. He went to the fire that burned in the room, and he took from it a burning brand, a piece of wood, glowing and smoking at the end. And with it calmly, he drove the temptation from the room. The door closed, and he was alone again. And then, it is said, with that same piece of charred and blackened wood, he traced upon the wall the sign of the cross. And he returned to his quiet, to his stillness, to his thoughts and his prayers. Hatever truly happened in that room. So long ago, the meaning of the story is clear. Thomas would not be moved. Not by argument, not by anger, not by loneliness, not by temptation. His certainty was soft in its manner. He did not shout or rage or fight. But beneath that gentleness, his will was made of stone. And so the long year wore slowly on. You may hold a river still for a time by building a wall across it. But the water does not stop wishing to flow. It only waits. It gathers quietly behind the wall. And in the end, it finds its way. And Thomas, in his captivity, was like that river. He did not rage against the wall. He did not despair. He simply waited, quiet and patient and certain. And it is said that he did not waste that year at all. Far from it. He could not walk the roads, or preach, or study at the great universities. So he turned his prison into a place of learning. He read. He thought. He is said to have studied great works of philosophy and theology there in his confinement, to have committed vast portions of Scripture to memory. His body was held within the walls, but his mind ranged freely, as it always would, across the widest fields of thought. And slowly, slowly, the family began to understand. His was not a passing fancy. This was not the brief rebellion of a restless young man, soon to fade. This was who Thomas was. All the way down. They could hold him for a year. They could hold him for 10 years. And still, when they opened the door, they would find the same quiet, certain soul, with the same single question in his heart. At last, the family's resistance broke. Perhaps they simply grew weary. Perhaps they saw, finally, that they could not win, and that to keep fighting would only shame them further. His mother, it seems, came at last to accept what she could not change. And one day, the watch was lifted. The doors were opened. In some tellings, his sisters helped him slip quietly away. In others, he was simply, finally, allowed to go. However it happened, the captive year came to its end. Thomas was free. And free now, with his family's long resistance finally spent, he could return to the friars. To the road, to the future he had chosen, and never, for a single moment, let go of. And so, once more, he set out toward the north, toward learning, toward the great cities of thought. This time no riders came to stop him. No brothers appeared upon the road. The way was open at last. He went first to Paris, that vast, crowded, brilliant centre of study where scholars came from every land. And then onward, further still, to the city of Cologne, in the German lands to the north and east. For there, in Cologne, was a teacher. And not just any teacher. He was, by many accounts, the greatest scholar of the entire age. A man whose mind ranged across all of creation. The movement of the stars, the nature of stones and metals and minerals, the lives of plants and animals, the workings of the human body, and the deepest questions of the soul. He studied everything. He was curious about everything. His name was Albert. And in time, the world would call him Albert the Great. Albert was a Dominican, like Thomas. And he was perhaps the only man in all of Europe who had truly grasped the vast new world of Aristotle's ideas. The very ideas that had so thrilled young Thomas back in Naples. To study under Albert was to sit at the feet of the most learned man alive. And so Thomas came to Cologne and joined the circle of Albert's students and began quietly to learn. And now we come to one of the gentlest and most beloved stories of his whole life. For when Thomas arrived among the other students, they did not see a great mind. Not at all. What they saw was a very large, very heavy young man. Quiet, slow to speak, he almost never offered an opinion in their debates. He would sit and listen and say little or nothing at all. And so the other students, in the careless and unkind way of the young, gave him a nickname. They called him the Dumb Ox. The dumb ox. A big, silent, heavy creature. Slow, they thought, perhaps a little simple. He was so large and so quiet that surely they reasoned there could not be very much happening behind those calm, watchful eyes. How wrong they were. How completely, how wonderfully wrong. For behind that silence lay one of the most powerful minds the world has ever known. He simply felt no need to display it. He did not speak in order to be admired. He listened first, and he spoke only when he had something worth saying. There is a story that one kind student took pity on the silent ox. Thinking that Thomas was struggling to keep up with the difficult lessons, he offered to help him, to go over the material with him, gently, and explain the hard parts. And Thomas, humble as ever, gratefully accepted. But as the student tried to teach him, they came to a passage so difficult that the helper himself became confused. He lost the thread of it. He could not go on. And quietly, gently, so as not to embarrass him, Thomas explained it. Not only that passage, but the whole difficult matter, more deeply and more clearly than the other student had ever understood it himself. The young man was astonished. The ox, it turned out, was no ox at all. And then came the moment when the truth could no longer stay hidden. In those days, students would write and debate and defend their reasoning before the teacher and the class. And one of Thomas's writings, one of his careful arguments, came at last into the hands of Albert himself, the master. And Albert read it. And Albert understood at once what all the other students had missed entirely. That this silent, heavy, humble young man held within him a mind of extraordinary depth. A mind of rare and quiet power. A mind perhaps greater than his own. And it is said that Albert then spoke words that have echoed down through the centuries, all the way to us, here tonight. Standing before the very students who had mocked Thomas as a dumb ox, the great teacher said, in effect, "You call him the dumb ox. But I tell you this, that this ox will one day bellow so loudly that his bellowing will fill the whole world." And he was right. More right, perhaps, than even he could have known. For the quiet young man, the captive who would not be moved, the silent student they had laughed at, was about to begin his true work. The work of a lifetime. The great and patient attempt to weave together reason and faith, the mind and the soul, Aristotle and Scripture. To build, out of careful thought, a vast cathedral of understanding. The ox was about to bellow. But that is a story for another night. For now, let us leave Thomas there, in Cologne, at the side of his great teacher. No longer a captive, no longer mocked. Simply a quiet man, with empty hands and an endless question, and a mind like a slow and rising tide. Finally free, finally home in the world of thought he was born for, about to begin. So let it rest there for tonight. Let the long road north grow soft and far away. Let the walls of the castle and the dust of the journey and the voices of the laughing students all grow quiet and dim and distant. There is nothing more for you to do now. Nothing to remember, nothing to carry. Only to breathe, slow and soft and easy. And to rest. And to drift. Thank you for spending this quiet hour here in the quiet Pantheon. Whenever you are ready, the story of Thomas and his great bellowing will be waiting, warm and dim and patient, to continue. But not now. Now, there is only rest. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. And good night. Good evening, and welcome once again to the Quiet Pantheon. I'm glad you're here in this quiet hour at the end of the day. Settle in. Let yourself grow comfortable and still feel the weight of your body sinking down, growing heavier and warmer into whatever holds you. Let your shoulders drop just a little. Let your jaw soften. Let the small muscles around your eyes grow loose and easy. And let your breathing slow, all on its own. In and gently out. In and slowly out. There is nothing you need to do now, nowhere you need to be, nothing left to carry or solve or finish. The day is behind you, and it asks nothing more of you tonight. You do not need to follow every word that I say. You do not need to remember anything at all. My voice is simply here to walk beside you, softly as you drift down and down towards sleep. Tonight, we come to the great middle of our story, the long, rich years of Thomas Aquinas, at the very height of his powers. The years in which the silent ox, just as his old teacher had promised, began at last to bellow. We will move through it all very slowly, as we always do. Let the words wash over you gentle and warm, like a slow tide on a quiet shore. When we last left him, he was in the city of Cologne, studying at the side of the great Albert. He had been a captive of his own family and was now free. He had been mocked by the other students as a dumb ox, slow and silent, and had quietly been revealed as a mind of rare and gentle power. And now the years came when that power would pour itself out into the world, like water from a spring that never runs dry. From Cologne, in time, Thomas went on to Paris, the beating heart of learning in all of Europe, the place where the brightest minds of the age gathered, to argue and to teach and to learn. And there, after long years of patient study, Thomas became a master, a teacher in his own right, one of those who stood at the front of the hall and shaped the minds of all who listened. To picture his world, imagine the University of Paris in those days. Narrow streets winding between tall houses, crowded with students from every land you could name. Cold halls of grey stone, where young men sat on straw scattered across the floor, wrapped in their cloaks against the chill, listening, arguing, scratching their notes onto wax tablets and rough sheets of parchment by the light of small windows and smoking candles. The air thick with chalk dust and candle smoke, and the low, steady murmur of Latin, the language of learning, spoken in 100 different accents. It was a place of great public debates. A master would stand before a crowded hall and face a storm of difficult questions thrown at him one after another, and answer them, each in its turn, with calm and order, before the watching crowd. It was a world of fierce intelligence, and fierce argument and sharp ambition. Reputations were made and broken in those halls. And into this world came Thomas, calm, enormous, gentle, and quietly, completely unstoppable. Now let us speak of how he worked, for it was truly extraordinary. Even those who knew him well, and saw it with their own eyes, could scarcely believe what they were seeing. Thomas had a mind that could hold many things at once, with perfect order and perfect calm. It is said that he could dictate to several scribes at the very same time. He would speak aloud the words of one work on one subject to one secretary until that thought was complete. And then he would turn to another scribe, sitting nearby, and continue an entirely different work, on an entirely different subject, picking up exactly where he had left it. And then perhaps to a third, holding several great chains of thought in his mind at once, each one clear, each one perfectly ordered, none of them ever tangling with the others. It was as though, inside that quiet head, there were many rooms, and in each room a different work was patiently being built. And he had a gift of deep, total concentration. When Thomas was truly thinking, the whole world seemed simply to fall away from him. The noise, the people, the passing of the hours, all of it faded until there was nothing left but the question before him, and the slow, certain movement of his mind toward its answer. There is a famous story, told and retold for many centuries, of a great feast at the court of the King of France. Thomas had been invited there as a guest, and he was seated among the lords and the ladies and all the noise and colour and glitter of a royal banquet. The candlelight gleaming on silver and gold, the music drifting from the corners of the hall, the rich food and the flowing wine, and the endless ripple of talk and laughter all around him, and in the middle of all of it, Thomas fell silent. He grew still. He was lost in thought, wrestling somewhere deep inside himself with a difficult question that had followed him even to the king's own table. The conversation flowed on around him, bright and busy. The courtiers laughed and talked and paid the large quiet friar no mind at all, and Thomas saw none of it. He heard none of it. He was somewhere else entirely, far away, in the deep and silent country of his own thoughts. And then, suddenly, he brought his great fist down upon the table, so hard that the dishes rattled, and the wine trembled in the cups, and the whole bright room fell silent at once. And he declared aloud, to no one and to everyone, that he had found it. The answer! The settling of the argument he had been turning over. The whole banquet stared at him, startled, forks paused in the air. His friend who had brought him there leaned over and gently reminded him where he was. That he sat at the table of the King of France himself. And Thomas, suddenly aware, was embarrassed and offered his apology. He had simply forgotten for a little while that the rest of the world was there at all. He had been deep inside the great cathedral of his own thought, and he had not meant to be rude. The king, it is said, was not angry. He was charmed, and he asked that a scribe be brought, so that the friar's new thought would not be lost. And what was he building in that great cathedral of thought? This is the very heart of it. This is the work for which the whole world still remembers his name 800 years later. Thomas had set himself one of the most ambitious tasks that any thinker has ever attempted in all of history. He wished to bring together two great rivers, two mighty currents of human understanding that many wise people of his time believed could never meet, that were destined, they thought, to flow forever apart. On the one side, there was the river of faith, Scripture, revelation, the truths held quietly in the heart and in the soul, the things believed but not seen, the things received as a gift rather than worked out as a sum. And on the other side, there was the river of reason, logic, observation, the careful, patient step-by-step philosophy of the ancient Greeks, and above all of Aristotle. The truths worked out, slowly and surely, by the human mind alone, with no help but its own careful thinking. Many people in his age feared these two rivers, and the meeting of them. Some said that reason was a dangerous thing, that the bold new ideas of Aristotle flooding back into Europe would poison faith and wash it away, and so they must be kept far apart, behind high walls. Others leaned so far toward reason, and trusted it so completely, that faith seemed to slip quietly out of their hands altogether. The two camps argued and worried and watched each other with suspicion. But Thomas believed something quietly radical, something that, in its calm way, would change the shape of thought for centuries to come. He believed that truth cannot contradict truth, that if God is the author of all things, both the wide world that reason studies and the deep revelation that faith receives, then the two can never, in the end, be truly at war with one another. Reason and faith, he believed, were not enemies, circling each other warily. They were two paths winding up the very same mountain towards the very same summit. And so he set out to show it, patiently, carefully, step by careful step. He took the sharp and shining tools of Aristotle's logic, and rather than fearing them, he picked them up and he used them in the service of faith. He wrote vast works, ordered and balanced like great cathedrals of stone, each question examined from every side, each doubt, each objection given its full and fair and honest hearing, before ever he gave his own reply. And this was his way, his deep, quiet, unshakable honesty. He never knocked down a weak and feeble version of an argument he disagreed with. He never took the easy path of fighting a shadow. Instead, he would state the case against his own view as strongly, as fairly, as powerfully as he possibly could. He would gather every reason, every objection, and set them out in their full strength. Sometimes he made the opposing case better than its own defenders ever had, and only then, having given it all of its power, would he gently and thoroughly and kindly answer it. There was a deep fairness in his thinking, a deep humility. He was not trying to win. He was trying to understand. His greatest work, the one above all the others, was a vast book called the Summa Theologiae. The name means roughly a summary or a summit of all theology. But do not let that small word summary fool you for a moment. It was enormous. It was a whole ordered universe of questions and answers built patiently, one upon another, reaching from the existence of God high above, all the way down through the nature of the created world, the workings of the human soul, the meaning of goodness and of virtue, and the long, winding shape of a life well lived. He meant it in part as a gentle guide for students, a clear and ordered map to lead a beginner through the whole vast and tangled landscape of faith without getting lost. And here is a remarkable thing, a thing worth resting on for a moment. He never even finished it. Death came before the final pages were written. And yet, even unfinished, even incomplete, it still stands today as one of the towering achievements of the entire human mind, like a great cathedral, left without its final spire, and beautiful even so. Within this great work lies one of his most famous passages of all, what later ages would come to call the 5 ways, 5 separate paths by which Thomas believed the patient human reason could make its way step by step toward the existence of God. We need not follow them closely tonight. You may simply let them drift past like distant lights. But feel the gentle shape of just one of them, softly as you rest. Thomas looked out at the world around him, and he saw that everything moves, everything changes, nothing stays exactly as it is. And he saw that each thing that moves is moved by something before it, which is itself moved by something before that, and that, again, by something before it still, a long chain stretching back and back and back into the depths of time. And he reasoned, quietly, that this chain cannot stretch backward forever, with nothing at all to begin it, that somewhere, at the very root of everything, there must be a first source of all motion, a first cause, something that itself is unmoved and unbegun, that set all the rest in gentle motion. And this, said Thomas, this first unmoved source of all things, is what we mean when we say the word God, and whether one follows his reasoning all the way to its end or not, see what he was doing, see the heart of it. He was treating the very deepest questions of faith not as things merely to be felt, in a rush of emotion, or merely declared, and never examined, but as things worthy of the most careful, the most rigorous, the most honest thought a human being could give them. He honoured faith by bringing to it the full and patient power of the reasoning mind, and he honoured reason by aiming it at last at the very highest things there are. That was the great work of his life, the weaving together of the two rivers, the long, patient bringing of peace between the heart and the mind. And yet for all of this, Thomas was never merely a cold machine of logic, grinding out its proofs. This is important to know, if you are to know him at all. He was a man of deep feeling and deeper prayer. Those who lived beside him said that his greatest insights, his clearest moments, came not only from his hours of study, bent over his books, but from long, quiet hours of devotion, when he was stuck fast on some difficult problem, and the answer would not come. It is said that he would not only think, he would go and pray and weep sometimes, and wait in stillness. And then, often, gently, the answer would arrive, like dawn coming slowly to a dark room. And there was another side to him still, softer even than that. Thomas was a poet. He was asked once to compose the words and the hymns for a great feast of the Church. And the hymns that he wrote, all those long centuries ago, are still sung today, still sung 800 years later, in quiet churches, by candlelight, all around the world, gentle, glowing words of wonder and devotion. So the very same hand that wrote those vast, towering, rigorous arguments also wrote tender poetry, meant to be sung softly, in the dark, to comfort the heart. The mind and the heart in Thomas were never truly divided. He lived in himself the very harmony that he spent his whole life trying to describe. And through all of it, through all the fame which grew and grew, through all the towering work, through all the great debates, argued and won before admiring crowds, Thomas remained, in his manner, exactly what he had always been: quiet, humble, gentle, heavy and slow, and unfailingly kind. He did not boast. He did not push himself forward. He did not seek after power, or position, or wealth. He turned down high offices that were offered to him again and again, preferring to remain a simple friar, teaching, writing, praying. He kept all the way to the very end of his life the empty hands that he had chosen as a young man on the day he gave away his inheritance. The fame gathered thick around him like a crowd in a square, and he seemed somehow barely to notice it at all. For he was still at heart the very same boy from the mountain monastery, still asking, beneath everything, the one single, endless, gentle question that he had carried since he was 5 years old. What is God? All the great books, all the careful arguments, all the towering works of his mind were only ever this: a grown man still asking a child's deepest question with all the strength he had. For years upon years, the work poured out of him, steady and unceasing. Books, commentaries on Scripture and on Aristotle, answers to thousands upon thousands of questions, great and small. He taught in Paris and then in Italy, in Rome and in Orvieto, and at last in his own beloved Naples, the bright city by the sea, where the whole story had first begun so many years before. He wrote enough in his not very long life to fill many great heavy volumes, more than most people could ever read in a lifetime, let alone sit down and write. The ox was bellowing now, just exactly as old Albert had promised so long ago in Cologne, and the great sound of it was filling the world. But no life, however bright, stays at its summit forever. The sun climbs, and the sun must also begin at last to descend. And as Thomas entered the final years of his story, something was waiting quietly for him, up ahead, on the road. Something that all his vast and patient reasoning could not prepare him for. An experience so deep and so overwhelming that it would silence even him, even that endless, tireless voice. It would make him lay down his pen, the pen that had never once seemed to rest in all those years, and write no more, ever again. What could possibly silence a mind like that? What could be so great that, beside it, even the towering Summa would seem a small and quiet thing? That is the story we will tell, gently, in our final part together. The story of the great silence that came at the end of all his words. But not tonight. Tonight, there is no need to reach for the ending. Tonight, we simply leave him here, at his work, at the height of his long day. Leave him in a quiet room, the candle burning low and golden, a scribe or two sitting near, pens ready. His great, calm, patient mind moving like a slow and certain river, wide and deep, toward the distant sea. At peace, at work, doing the thing he was born to do. So let it rest there for tonight. Let the lecture halls and the royal banquets and the towering books all grow soft and dim and far away. Let the great questions settle quietly around you, like snow falling in the dark, and let them ask nothing of you at all. There is nothing for you to solve tonight, nothing to finish, nothing to hold on to, only to breathe, slow and soft and easy, and to rest and to drift gently down into sleep. Thank you for spending this quiet hour here, with me in the quiet Pantheon. Whenever you are ready, and not a moment before, the last part of the story of Thomas will be waiting for you. Warm and dim and patient, like a candle left burning in a window. But not now. Now there is only rest. Now there is only the quiet and the dark and the slow rise and fall of your own breathing. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and good night, good evening, and welcome one last time to this quiet corner of the quiet Pantheon. I'm glad you're here for the ending of our story. Make yourself comfortable as you always do. Let your body grow heavy and warm and soft. Let your shoulders sink. Let your hands grow still and open. Let the breath move slowly through you, all on its own. In and gently out. In and slowly out. There is no hurry now. There is nowhere else to be. There is nothing you need to do tonight, nothing to carry, nothing to remember. The day is over, and it asks nothing more of you. You do not need to follow every word. Let my voice simply walk beside you, soft and low, as you drift down and down into sleep. Tonight we come to the end of the long life of Thomas Aquinas, the boy from the mountain, the captive who would not be moved, the silent ox whose bellowing came at last to fill the whole world. It is a gentle ending, and a strange one, and in its own quiet way, a beautiful one. Let us walk toward it slowly, together hand in hand, through the soft dark. By now, Thomas was a man in his late 40s. He had spent his whole life in ceaseless, patient work, writing and teaching and reasoning and building, stone by careful stone, his great cathedral of thought. His vast Summa was still unfinished, but it was growing, always growing, reaching higher with every passing month. His days were full to the brim with words, with questions and answers, and the slow, steady scratch of the pen. He had grown heavier with the years, and slower in his step. The long hours bent over his writing had worn at him, the way water wears gently at stone. And yet his mind was as clear and as deep and as patient as it had ever been. Those who came to hear him teach in those final years said that the great calm river of his thought flowed on, wide and unhurried, just as it always had. No one, watching him work, could have guessed how near the end of the road he truly was. And in these final years, he had returned to Naples, the bright city by the sea, the very place where, as a young man so long ago, he had first met the ideas of Aristotle, and first seen the poor barefoot friars, and first chosen the path that would shape his entire life. The story was circling, quietly, gently, back toward the place where it had all begun, as a long day, at its end, returns at last to the soft light from which it started. And then came a single day that changed everything, a day that all his vast learning could not have foreseen. It was near the very end of the year 1273, early in the month of December, the air growing cool, the days growing short, the light low and golden in the afternoons. And Thomas, as he did every single morning of his life, was celebrating Mass in the quiet of the church. And during that Mass, on that ordinary winter morning, something happened to him. Something he would never fully describe to anyone. Something deep and overwhelming, and entirely, utterly beyond the reach of words. We do not know, even now, exactly what he experienced in that quiet hour. He kept it almost entirely to himself, locked in the silence of his own heart. But those who were near him saw plainly that he came away from that altar a changed man. Something in him had shifted, the way the light shifts when a cloud passes over the sun. Some who were there said he seemed lost in a deep and tender silence afterward, that he moved through the following days, as a man moves through a half-remembered dream, present and yet somehow also very far away. He did not weep. He did not seem afraid. He seemed, if anything, at peace. As though he had set down some great and heavy burden that he had carried without complaint for a very long time, and had only now discovered how heavy it had been. And from that day forward, Thomas stopped writing, the pen that had never rested in all those long and tireless years, the mind that had poured out millions upon millions of careful words. It all fell silent. He set his great work gently aside, unfinished, with so many pages still left to write. And he would not take it up again. His friend and faithful companion, a man named Reginald, who had walked beside him for years, was deeply troubled by this. He did not understand it. The Summa was so near to complete. There was still so much good work left to do, so many questions still waiting for Thomas's gentle answers. Why had the master suddenly laid down his pen? And so Reginald, gently and then less gently, began to urge him. He pressed him to return to his writing, to finish, at last, the great work he had begun so many years before. And Thomas answered him, quietly, with words that have never since been forgotten, words that have echoed down across 800 years, all the way to this dark and quiet room. He said simply, Reginald, I cannot. Such things have been revealed to me, that all I have written now seems to me as so much straw. As so much straw. Let those soft words rest in the air for a moment. As you lie there in the dark, here was a man who had written more, and written more deeply, than almost anyone who had ever lived. Towering works of reason, a whole cathedral of patient, careful thought, the labour, the treasure of an entire lifetime. And now he looked upon all of it, every page, every argument, and he did not call it wrong. He did not call it false. He did not regret it. He simply said that beside what he had now somehow glimpsed, it all seemed as light, and as dry, and as small as straw. Straw. The thin, dry stalk that is left behind in the field, after the golden grain has all been gathered in. He had seen, it seems, the grain itself, the thing itself. And beside it, even his own greatest work felt to him like the husk, like the dry and empty stalk that once held something living, and now blew light upon the wind. Think of a harvest at the end of summer, all the long months of labour in the field, the planting and the waiting and the tending and the slow ripening under the sun. And then at the very end, the golden grain is gathered and carried home and kept. And the dry straw, which had held it all up toward the light, is left behind in the empty field, light enough for the wind to lift and scatter. Thomas had spent his whole life raising the straw towards the sun. And now, at the end, he had been given, for one moment, the grain. There is something profoundly humbling in this, and at the same time, something strangely, deeply peaceful. The greatest thinker of his entire age, at the very end of his road, gently setting down all of his thinking, not in bitterness, not in despair, but in a kind of quiet awe, as though he had spent his whole long life carefully describing the shore, every grain of sand, every stone, and had finally, for one single overwhelming moment, looked up and seen the sea. He had asked ever since he was a small boy in a mountain monastery one single question: what is God? He had carried it through captivity and study and fame and labour for more than 40 years. And perhaps, on that quiet December morning, at that altar, in some way far beyond all telling, he had been given a glimpse of the answer. An answer too vast and too bright for any book that has ever been written to hold, and so Thomas wrote no more. His great work would remain forever unfinished, and later, gentle hands would gather together his earlier writings to complete the shape of what he had left undone. But the master himself had laid down his pen, for good and for the last time. He had entered at the end a great and gentle quiet, the quiet of a man who has said all that words can say, and has come at last to the edge of something that words cannot reach. Now, in those very same winter months, a summons came for him from far away. The Pope had called for a great council of the Church to be held in the distant northern city of Lyon, and Thomas, as one of the most respected minds in all of Christendom, was asked to attend, to lend his wisdom to the gathering. And though he was weary now, deeply weary, and though something in him had already turned, quietly, toward the ending, he obeyed. He was a friar. He had taken his vows. And so he set out once more upon the long road, an old and tired and gentle traveller now, so far from the strong young man who had walked these same roads decades before, with all his life still ahead of him. The roads were cold now, in the deep of winter, the hills bare, the trees stripped, the light thin and pale. He travelled slowly, resting often, carried as much as walking. Each mile took from him a little more of the strength that remained, and still he went on, north toward the council. Because he had been asked, and because, all his life, he had done the quiet, faithful thing that was asked of him, without complaint. But Thomas would never reach the city of Lyon. He would never sit at that great council. For on the long journey, somewhere along the way, he grew ill. There is a story, often told, that as he rode, lost as ever in his own deep thoughts, he struck his head against the low branch of a fallen tree, leaning across the road, and was hurt by it. Whatever the true cause may have been, his strength, already failing, now began to leave him in earnest. He could not go on. He could not finish the long, cold journey to the north. And so he was brought to rest and to recover, if he could, to a quiet monastery that lay along the way, a Cistercian abbey called Fossa Nova, a peaceful place of grey stone and silence set among the hills, and it was there, within those calm and gentle walls, that the last days of Thomas Aquinas were quietly spent. Picture that abbey in the winter quiet. The grey stone, cold to the touch. The bare cloisters where the monks walked in silence. The thin winter sun, falling pale through the high windows. The slow ringing of the bells, marking out the hours, just as the bells of Monte Cassino had marked them so very long ago, when Thomas was only a small and watchful boy. The story, you see, was circling all the way back. From a quiet monastery to a quiet monastery, from bells to bells, from silence to silence. The monks of Fossa Nova cared for him tenderly. They knew, of course, what a great man had come, by chance, to rest among them in his weakness. They did all that they could for him, and it is said that, even as he lay there slowly weakening day by day, they came to him with a small and humble request. These quiet country monks, in the presence of the most famous teacher in all of the world, asked him if he would offer them some last words of wisdom, if he would explain to them simply a passage of Scripture. And the dying Thomas, gentle to the very last, did exactly as they asked. He gathered what strength remained in him, and softly, from his sick bed, he gave them his final teaching, his last words on the things he had spent his whole life pondering, given not in a great hall, before a roaring crowd of students, not at the table of a king, but quietly, to a small circle of kind and ordinary monks, gathered close around a humble bed in a country abbey in the failing light. It was, perhaps, exactly the ending he would have chosen. Small, quiet, kind. And near the end, he asked to receive the last rites of his faith, the final comforts of the church he had served all his life. And when the sacred bread was brought before him, this man who had written so very many thousands of careful, brilliant words about its deepest meaning, spoke now, it is said, with the simple, trusting devotion of a small child. All his vast and towering learning had never once made him proud. At the very end, he was as humble and as full of wonder as the little boy who had once tugged at the sleeves of the monks of Monte Cassino, and asked them, "What is God?" The circle of his life was closing now, soft and complete. He had begun as a child, in a house of stone and silence, asking the largest of all questions, and he was ending as an old man, in a house of stone and silence, with that same question finally laid to rest in his heart. Everything in between, the captivity, the fame, the towering books, all of it had been the long road that led from the one quiet place to the other. Picture that abbey, in the winter quiet. The grey stone, cold to the touch. The bare cloisters, where the monks walked in silence. The thin winter sun, falling pale through the high windows. The slow ringing of the bells, marking out the hours, just as the bells of Monte Cassino had marked them so very long ago, when Thomas was only a small and watchful boy. The story, you see, was circling all the way back, from a quiet monastery to a quiet monastery, from bells to bells, from silence to silence. The monks of Fossa Nova cared for him tenderly. They knew, of course, what a great man had come, by chance, to rest among them in his weakness. They did all that they could for him, and it is said that, even as he lay there slowly weakening, day by day, they came to him with a small and humble request. These quiet country monks, in the presence of the most famous teacher in all of the world, asked him if he would offer them some last words of wisdom, if he would explain to them simply a passage of Scripture. And the dying Thomas, gentle to the very last, did exactly as they asked. He gathered what strength remained in him, and softly, from his sick bed, he gave them his final teaching, his last words on the things he had spent his whole life pondering, given not in a great hall, before a roaring crowd of students, not at the table of a king, but quietly, to a small circle of kind and ordinary monks, gathered close around a humble bed in a country abbey in the failing light. It was perhaps exactly the ending he would have chosen. Small, quiet, kind. And near the end, he asked to receive the last rites of his faith, the final comforts of the church he had served all his life. And when the sacred bread was brought before him, this man who had written so very many thousands of careful, brilliant words about its deepest meaning, spoke now, it is said, with the simple, trusting devotion of a small child. All his vast and towering learning had never once made him proud. At the very end, he was as humble and as full of wonder as the little boy who had once tugged at the sleeves of the monks of Monte Cassino and asked them, "What is God?" The circle of his life was closing now, soft and complete. He had begun as a child in a house of stone and silence, asking the largest of all questions. And he was ending as an old man, in a house of stone and silence, with that same question finally laid to rest in his heart. Everything in between, the captivity, the fame, the towering books, all of it had been the long road that led from the one quiet place to the other, the dumb ox, just exactly as old Albert had promised so many years before in the cold halls of Cologne. The dumb ox had bellowed so loudly, in the end, that his great voice filled the whole world. And it is bellowing still, quietly, gently, across 800 long years, reaching, even now, even tonight, into this still and darkened room, where you lie, drifting softly towards sleep. And so we come, you and I, to the end of our story. Let us hold its whole shape gently, one last time, like a smooth stone in the palm of the hand, as you drift down towards sleep. A quiet boy, in a mountain monastery, looking up at the monks and asking, "What is God?" A young man, giving away wealth and rank and power for empty hands and an endless question. A captive, held a year in his family's tower, who could not be moved. A silent student, mocked by the careless as a dumb ox, who turned out to carry a universe of thought behind his calm and watchful eyes. A patient, gentle mind, building a great cathedral of understanding, weaving reason and faith into one single peaceful whole. And at the very last, an old and tired and gentle soul, laying down his tireless pen in quiet awe, and calling all his life's great work mere straw, because he had glimpsed, for one shining moment, the grain. There is a deep, deep peace in his ending, the peace of a life that was fully and completely spent, nothing held back, nothing hoarded, the peace of a single question, carried faithfully, all the way down the long years to its own quiet answer, and the peace of a man who worked with all his might for as long as he was given, and then at the very end simply let it all go, softly, gently, with open, empty hands. The same empty hands he had chosen as a young man on the very first day. And now there is nothing more for you to do either. You have followed the whole long journey now, from the warm castle on its hill, all the way to the quiet abbey in the grey of dawn, the whole of a life, the whole of our story. And there is nothing left for you to carry now, nothing to remember, nothing to finish. Let the candle burn low and lower. Let the great voice fall, at last gently silent. Let the whole long story dissolve, softly, into the dark, like mist over the morning hills. There is only your breathing now, slow and soft and easy. Only the warmth, only the quiet, only rest. Let each part of the story you have heard, across these quiet nights, settle now, and grow soft and fade. The castle on the hill, the bells on the mountain, the long captive year, the laughing students and the patient teacher, the crowded halls of Paris, the candle and the scribes and the great unfinished book, and the old gentle soul, at the end laying it all down with open hands. Let all of it grow dim and warm and far away. There is nothing there that you need to hold. It will keep safe and quiet until you wish to return. Thank you for spending these quiet hours here, in the quiet Pantheon, among the great and gentle and quiet minds of the past. It has been an honor to keep you company, here in the dark on the way to sleep. And now there is only this. Let yourself sink, soft and warm and safe, down into sleep. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and good night.